Hello, this is Juha, and today I'm talking a little bit about how to make pixel art out of something a little bit more painted graphic style. And what I have here is something I painted quickly with Photoshop. It's an incredible space marine, and as you can see, we have quite a bit of all sorts of gradients and anti-aliased shapes here. What I want to do is make this into something pixely, something you might find in one of those retro-inspired pixely titles. And my method is pretty straightforward. It doesn't apply to everything, but it should give you a starting point to move forward. I use this simple palette to paint the picture, and now that I have something ready, I can start limiting the color palette, as it were. And to do that, there are a few things you might want to consider. First of all, I've left the background of the image blank. I usually paint with some sort of filled background, something like a grayish mid-tone color, something like this. But when I'm ready for with the picture, I just delete the layer and there you go. And next, what we want to do is go to image mode and select indexed color. What this does is it limits the amount of colors in the picture to a specific palette. Photoshop automatically loads the previous settings that I've been using, but we can take a look at what else is there. First of all, you see the palette options, and we can't use exact because there are more colors than 256 in this picture. The palette index only goes as far as 8 bits, which is 256 colors. So we could try using something like system color palette for macOS or Windows, and they use the default color palette of Windows and Mac OS. But these are not really, they changed the color palette so much that I don't really feel comfortable using those. The web is an alteration of the Mac OS color palette, and it uses 216 colors. We don't want to use that sort of palette with game art. Uniform. What uniform does is quite interesting. When you have the box, the color box here, the uniform palette actually takes colors from the box evenly and just uses those colors, and the result is amazing. Of course, but we don't really care about that. What we are interested in are the local and possibly the master palettes. These have slight variations, as you can see when I browse through them with my arrow keys. The palette changes a little bit, so you're just gonna have to use your eyes and see what's best for your purposes. And the master palettes are grayed out because they actually compile the palette from all the open images in Photoshop, and we only have one image open, so we can't actually use these. But compared to the local palettes, we could do something interesting like create a couple of new pictures here, make that white, make the other picture maybe red, and then when we use the index color and go to the master, it factors in the open images, and that's how that works. I don't know if that does anything to you, but you can just stick using the local palettes. Then what you can do is actually select how many colors you want for your image, and this goes as low as 1. But you're gonna have to select the amount of colors you want for your picture by just eyeballing the thing. And I usually go for the details because I want my character to have those white light spots that you can see in the unpreviewed version of the image here. But we can't have them with like 20 colors. So we just have to go all the way to the 40 colors, but I don't want to use that many colors. The problem is that when you use that many colors, you start to get this anti-aliasing, these smooth little in-between pixels here, and they really can ruin your picture depending on what you're doing. So what I want to do is maybe go with something like 10 colors, and then what we can do is go to the forced option and select custom. Now, I don't really have a black color in the picture, so I also want to use something like straight black, and I also want to use white for my picture. So we go with those two and let the Photoshop figure out the rest of it. So now we have black in the little doodads in the guy's chest, and we have white in the eyes, just the way I want it. If you don't want to use transparency, you can deselect the transparency option, but I like using the transparency option because it clearly defines the boundaries of the character. And it's not that big of a deal. I mean, the sprite is already too big for any game that I would be creating. So instead, what I might do is just go with the current palette and then decrease the size of the image and then do alterations and fixes for the final thing. Finally, what you can do is select the diffusion mode for the picture, and there are a couple of different options here. The diffusion adds a strange little diffuse pattern to the gradients of the picture, and you can actually change the amount of diffusion you want for your picture. So something subtle might be actually what I might want for some pictures, but it's a little bit of a acquired taste. There's also a pattern that does this ghastly little pattern the gradient places. And finally we have noise, which is probably the best one of the bunch, if you could change the amount of noise that you want for the picture. I usually opt not to use any of these, but that's just my preference. So if I click OK, first of all you see here that the image mode of the picture is actually set to index instead of RGB like these two, which I am going to close here. Now the problem with index color is that if I now wanted to start painting something else in the picture, like so, I'm not gonna get these different colors because I'm using an indexed palette. I only have 10 colors in the whole image, so this is all I'm gonna get. If I wanted to start adding more colors to the image, I would have to go to the image mode and set it back to RGB. Then I can start doing all sorts of weird things again. Now, I don't know what you guys think about these smooth little edges here. I don't really care for them, and I would really prefer this to be more of a harsh transition. But like I said, this is a limited method, so you can only use it to do specific things. And if you're okay with that, then this might work for you, okay. But of course, what I want to do with the converted image is go ahead and decrease the size to something usable. Currently it's 640 by 640. So I think I'm gonna go with something like 64. And it already gets me closer to the finalized version. Here you can see a lot of problems that come from the resample mode. We were currently using the automatic resample, which does smooth things up quite a bit. And then we're introduced to some sort of half opaque pixels, which I don't really like. So we could select an eraser and start going through these things and just pick them off. But how do you know that these aren't half opaque? Like here, you can see a little bit of the background is coming through. You would have to do quite a bit of work. What I like to do sometimes with these things is just keep duplicating the layer and then merge them together. And that way you get a little bit more solid picture. But of course, that's not what we want to do here. So let me just undo a bunch of these changes. Here we go. We're back to the big guy. And we're back to the index color mode. Now if we do resizing in the index mode, then resample doesn't matter. Because remember, we are limited to a specific palette. So if I do the decrease size here, we actually do get the same palette uniformly. Now, this is one way to go about it. If you already have changed the image to RGB, I'm going to do that real quick here. Then what you can do is go to the image size and choose nearest neighbor as resample mode. And this will preserve the pixel quality of your little sprite there. So you get the same end result, and we can also do different sort of colors here, like that. Now, as you can see, the picture itself is quite messy. So what I would do is I would start going through this and just fix things, because it requires a lot of fixing, and that's the downside of this method. This is why I mostly don't do this anymore, except maybe with some specific images. So mostly I like going in and just painting straight pixels, because that just saves time. That's how it is. So I would start doing this sort of thing and just like cleaning up the thing. If you use eraser, you're gonna have to select the pencil mode for the eraser, and I would just start doing this. Now what I also want to mention is how you would do this with Krita. If you don't know, Krita is a free image editing software, and I would maybe even classify it as a painting software, as opposed to image editing, which Photoshop is more about. But Krita is free, and you can find the download link in the description of the video, and you can do a lot of things with this software alone. I don't really like the way you handle pixel painting with Krita. You can do it, but some things are more limited with it, and that's kind of a problem for me. But then again, some things like animation and actually color indexing are a lot better with Krita. If we actually wanted to do something like add a blue orb to this guy's chest, let me see here, let's get a brush and paint a blue orb. Let's get a little shadow there, and so on and so forth, and we could make this a little bit smaller. It doesn't really matter what it's like. I would just like to demonstrate why Krita is better with the color indexing than Photoshop. Because now we have a completely different color in the character sprite, and automatic indexing can do a great job with a similar kind of colors, but when you add something completely different, it might not be as flexible as you would like. Let me show you what I mean here. So, how you do color indexing in Krita? Let me move this a little bit to the left here. You add a new layer to the picture. You go to the little arrow next to the plus sign and you select a filter layer. And here you can find a bunch of filters like you would in Photoshop, except that we can actually select an index colors layer. If I press OK and then come back here and select the properties of the layer, you can get a little bit more compact version of it. And this is already better. So with Krita, you can just create a layer that does the color indexing, and you can turn it on and off just like you would any layer in Photoshop. But here we're limiting the palette of the character, and as you can see, the blue is completely gone because the algorithm doesn't like the way that it sticks out from everything else in the sprite. So it tries to force the blue color into the rest of the palette of the picture. What we can do about it in Krita is that we go to the properties and we can actually select specific color ranges that Krita then uses to create the palette of the image. So I would go here, select the light, and let's go with something like light blue. There we go. And we go to the base and select something like a little darker blue. And okay. And now we already start getting the blue values here that we can use for the palette. And it doesn't stop there, because as you may notice, the options for color indexing in Krita are incredibly versatile. If we zoom a little closer here, we can see a lot of these little ramps that go in between the different colors, like mid-tone gray to a darker gray to black. And with the index colors in Krita, you can select how many colors you actually want in between each of these ramps. And you can just go ahead here and reduce all of these to pretty much nothing. And you go down to 20 colors. And you can limit your color count to something that you would prefer, like maybe 12, I don't know. And then you start getting this sort of result. And when you go back here and start editing these and just look at the picture and see where the problem areas are. Like this area here is really, really tight. So I would maybe prefer if this section had more of a gradient to it. So I'm looking at, okay, where is that area? It's probably in between the base and the shadow. So I would go here and start increasing the base and the shadow. And there you go. You start getting more tones in between those two colors. And then you can go here and just limit the light and bright ramps. What you can also do is go to the indexing factors and start filling with these little controls. This is the lab image mode, which means you have lightness and then A and B color factors. You don't necessarily need to be familiar with the lab image mode, but it does help. But if you just use your eyes, you can just play around with these and see the results in the preview. So it doesn't matter too much. So the index colors in Krita are a lot more flexible, but I wouldn't necessarily use it to everything. If you have a lot of colors and you have to be really strict about what you leave in the image, then this is better for the job. But of course it gets harder because you really need to know the palette of your image and go around here and fiddle with the actual settings. Also, you get a lot of these transparent colors and you can't really do much about that, except maybe when you start making the image you use a pixel brush that limits the transparency of the sprite to a strict boundary. and go from there. So that's it. Thanks for checking out this tutorial on indexed colors.